incredibly powerful. That opens up huge realms of discussion, and I just want to plant the seed in people's minds to maybe ask me or Google or something. But the simple, the really interesting point that I think that makes clear is part of the viable system model is a thing called the good regulator theory, which is a regulator has to have as many degrees of freedom, as much complexity as the thing that it's seeking to regulate. You talked about intermediaries and they're a way of damping down the complexity to allow the regulator to work. And I think if you just thought about that insight, commissioning needs to have as many degrees of freedom as the system it is trying to make effective. That really helps to clarify a lot of things. So,
right. Just ask Frank off of Surrey County Council. I'm interested in the model. I think it's a great model actually, and I plan to use it elsewhere if I can, so that's great. But the one thing I was thinking that is not evident there that I would have expected to have seen there is something clearly on user engagement, potential user engagement, and that's with the emphasis on co-design, with the emphasis on choice, control, self-help.
Okay.
Where would you see that?
Yep. Yeah, good question. So, look, it goes up through here, but this becomes clear when you think about a voucher system, and my thinking on this has been clarified in working with and around the NDS. While I don't do work for the National Disability Insurance Agency anymore, I have people who come and talk to me, and so I keep having to grapple with the issues unpaid. If it's just a voucher scheme, or if it's just an open public service market, then I've got a slide, but I'll come back to that. Then the role of government is just as a distant regulator. Commissioning implies, the word commission comes from the Latin committere, to entrust. It implies that the state is entrusting, is charging somebody, its own people or external providers, and trusting them to do something on behalf of the state. So in the case of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, it isn't and can't just be people with a disability and their carers being given a bundle of money and they go and buy what they want. The state has an interest in, there is a policy dimension to this, there is a responsibility on the part of the state here. So part of the National Disability Insurance market is market-like, in that people can choose who provides to them, and there's going to be a regulatory quality to that, but there are public good dimensions to it as well, and that is where the commissioning comes in. You've got to design your system because it's not just a market, and you've got to manage that system, but I am entrusting someone to do something on my behalf. So you inevitably are coming back to those who are the custodian of the outcomes of the system, much more than in the past. We acknowledge we need to pay a lot more attention than we ever did to the beneficiaries or the service users. But there are public good dimensions as well. And to simply wash your hands and walk away and say they can all just choose ignores the fact that there is, in these systems, commission systems, there is, I am handing off to somebody who has responsibility to execute the public good, to make sure that the public good is met. And so that you're right, and but it flows up through those people, whoever they be, who are the custodians of the public good, the custodians of outcomes. No, gone the wrong way again. So, I don't get this. So I want to talk about this under three themes. The sort of what I think is we might bring to it. Firstly, that I think looking at commissioning as the discipline missing between policy and delivery, the design and stewardship of service delivery systems, and just a bit on public-to-public commissioning. Just some things that we might learn out of that. So on this first one, this guy was Social Security Minister in a government back in the 1980s, early 1980s, Fred Chaney. Worked for a minister for the Liberal government, a right of centre party, but he was on the left of that, and his life since he retired from politics 30 years ago has been spent with Indigenous communities in Western Australia. Aboriginal communities. And because we have given land rights to Aboriginals, and particularly in remote areas where there were fewer European claims, and because mining companies operate in that area, Indigenous communities have negotiated with, as part of granting access to their land, they've negotiated with mining companies to say, we don't just want a royalty, we'd like to talk to you about job training schemes for our people, and we'd like to talk to you about sustainable jobs for our people. So this is mining companies doing something that, if you like, government would traditionally do, establishing job training schemes and pathways to work. They're not doing that out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it because they've been told by the Indigenous owners of the land that this is what they want. And Fred is here comparing the way that mining companies manage those programs with the way that government does. On this quote, miners with their experience of project management better understand taking responsibility for managing towards a long-term outcome, dealing with complexities and problems as they arise. You learn from mistakes, you stop doing things that are unproductive, and you actively look for what will work. You do what needs to be done to achieve your objective. Now, this second slide, I have shown it to public sector audiences all around the world, and I get the same response. In contrast, how does government seem to me? 1 year funding with no continuity guaranteed, onerous and hence costly reporting requirements, frequent policy changes, lengthy negotiations about working to shared objectives that are dropped without apology or explanation because policies or priorities have changed. Agreements are made and then not honoured.
Sounds like the sustainable transformation plan process.
Half of an audience will have lived through that, and people are nodding deeply. Now, it's just worth pausing, and that is extraordinarily common, yes? Even today. That's madness. Think how mad that is. And it's utterly inexcusable that that is still an extraordinarily common experience in this day and age. It's just appalling. And so a lot of what this first element and what I'm grappling with in this work I'm doing, particularly within New South Wales, is concerned with how do we stop that? How do we get away from that? I was having lunch on somebody up at Oxford on Friday, and he was suggesting that he didn't know that it was possible within a government framework to get away from that sort of thing, and I can't believe that. And for me, a big part of what I'm doing at the moment, at least around commissioning, is about this. So there's several answers that are offered. There's this one. We've all seen that diagram. Most academics, at least in policy courses in Australia, teach that and then immediately tell their students that it hasn't made any difference at all. There are commissioning versions of that. And what it's all doing is essentially flowing in the same direction. There's no pushback, there's no conversation going on in this, and the commissioning involves pushback and conversation. This is essentially the policy class looking at the delivery class and saying, why aren't you doing what we told you to do? It's extraordinarily arrogant. It's about giving the delivery people a packed lunch, showing them to the front door, kissing them on the forehead and wishing them well in life. It's that process of handing off, and the evaluation stuff is still not seriously done. Another, over the years, we've had deliverology, performance targets, and that didn't turn out terribly well. You might recall. That's not to say that performance management isn't important. It's key to a lot of what I'm talking about here, and there are places where, and this is in fact Barbara's real experience, where people implementing the Prime Minister's or the Premier's top 10 achievables have made a huge difference. But we're not talking about a comprehensive system for managing the complexity of government. We're talking about delivering the government's top 10, 15 targets. So not a lot of success out of those. The other area is we've tried to use budgets, And performance. I mean, these things shifted back and forwards. But program and performance budgeting. I mean, it goes back. The origins of this are found much earlier, back in the 20s and 30s, in the US, in scientific management, and the belief that you could manage the whole of government from the centre if you just had the right levers. That sort of huge confidence that was associated with that period. Robert McNamara, then program budgeting work, he was head of, he turned down the offer to be head of the Treasury function for Kennedy and became head of defence. He'd come out of Ford, so he brought in program budgeting, management by objectives, zero-based budgeting was Pete Peer. He came out of Texas Instruments. And then, of course, payment by results here in the UK, Ronnie Cohen, who comes out of the city. So we're seeing an awful lot of private sector people coming in and offering solutions that they claimed made a difference in the private sector. And my favourite summary of those sort of models was Aaron Wildavsky, the great. He was actually quoting a public servant who said, some butterflies were caught, no elephants stopped. There's some reasons. There's a guy called Alan Schick who's done wonderful work on this over several decades as to why it is budgets are not a really good instrument for trying to exercise this kind of control. You can use it for expenditure control. It's not great for management control. Sorry, you were going to...
One of the things I've noticed is the central and local government is the reinventing of the wheel, depending on who's at the helm in terms of...
So, in New South Wales, we're back.
This is what I thought. Performance budgeting looks a lot like payment.
Yeah. Look, there are differences. In New South Wales, we've got performance budgeting back again. New South Wales government. I'm trying, and again, the former head of Treasury was chief financial officer of one of our biggest banks. He moved on rather unhappily because discovered government doesn't look like a bank at all. He's been replaced by a retail banker who's actually much better, but they're reinventing this all over again. They're going back and trying to see if you can run the complexity of a public service economy system with memos from the 23rd floor. So yes, you're quite right. These things, there's a lot of recycling has gone on in this space, and I would argue that's still the judgment. A few butterflies, no elephants. And I won't go into it here, but there are some really good reasons that Alan Schick has identified as to why budgets are not a great mechanism for doing this. So I have come back to arguing with more confidence than I did before. I think commissioning is the missing discipline. Now, it's extraordinarily, there's a reluctance on the part of governments to sort of pick up. They've got policy and cabinet decision-making mechanisms, and they've got budgetary mechanisms and Treasury. There's a reluctance to acknowledge that there's something missing. But I think what commissioning is saying is precisely that. Excuse me, but you're missing an entire discipline. And it's this interface between policy and funding and delivery. So here's a couple of, this is Australian, we in Australia have a tradition, new governments will often appoint a commission of audit to go in and sort of overhaul and review what government's like. This is one that the current government had 2014. The process of commissioning involves identifying and prioritising outcomes, designing measurable performance objectives that will inform government whether outcomes are being met and whether they're being delivered well, and it can be a tool for challenging policymakers to ensure they've clarified outcomes. That's not all of it. Commissioning's a lot more than that, but it's them focusing on that particular part of it. There was a somewhat better report done by the New Zealand Productivity Commission, a government think tank, 2015. It's a set of interrelated tasks that need to be undertaken to turn policy objectives into effective social services. a wider range of skills and capabilities are required than what we mean when we use the term procurement. So they need to make informed, deliberate choices about diverse issues, including objectives, needs, cost effectiveness, funding, pricing, risk management, quality, eligibility, performance management, information flows, provider market sustainability, interactions with other services. Quite a nice, I think quite a rich exposition of the mix, and typically of the New Zealanders, very, being done thoughtfully. A lot of this is about arrows that go in both directions. A lot of this, in my experience, is about honest conversations, and the word honest is fundamental to whether or not this is actually commissioning or just more of the same. And the sort of fundamental insight is, I think you can't hold a delivery agent to account if they are given vague or inconsistent objectives, the objectives aren't prioritised, you keep changing them, they're not adequately funded to deliver those objectives, or if you don't give them sufficient time to deliver. And that conversation between those who are handing off outcomes and resources to those who will deliver, the nature of that conversation, permission for those who deliver, and they are almost never given this. It's one of the reasons why, in fact, contractors, external contractors and private and not-for-profit are in a much better position than the public sector. Because in theory at least, there's been some examples in recent years where they haven't done it, but in theory the private sector can say, excuse me, but that's stupid. That's really nuts. I'm not going to do that. We don't normally give public sector providers that permission to say, you realise you can't hold me accountable if you give me 26 outcomes and give me budget for 3. Or if you give me 5 outcomes and you just change them next week. I can't manage in that kind of a world in order to make, that's not what management can do. Management can't do what management does in an environment where what you want keeps changing every 10 minutes. And that conversation is, I think, fundamental to this vertical part of the process of commissioning. It's the quality of that conversation. Now, obviously, designing the systems and processes and tools that enable you to make that happen is the tricky part. And it's not just about tools; it's about permission. It's about authority. It's a lever or levers and a place to stand. So the people who are commissioning have got to have the authority, the permission to say on behalf of delivery agents, to say to policy and to those who give time and money, this is not realistic and you can't hold these people accountable if you go down that route. They've got to be respected in that role of being able to stand up, and that respect and the quality of that. They're the custodians of the conversation, the commissioner, and the quality of that conversation will give them authority then to be able to hold delivery to account. Next week, I've got it's actually on the stick there. We've got in the prison space, which, as I said, is where we've been sort of giving this its test run. We've got the staff and supervisors at a prison talking to camera about what it was like when they were given this challenge. The prison governor gave them a committee of 12 people the challenge of working out how they would respond to better for less, and that conversation is possible because they believe it's honest. If it's not honest, then you won't get that kind of engagement. You won't get the union to come on board. You won't get the staff to tell the union they better come on board, which is where we've arrived at. The union leadership were reluctant to sign up to one of these. It was actually a very quasi-contractual arrangement, public to public, and the commissioned officers and the rank and file said, we want to do this. You don't get to that place where you get that kind of sign-in if the conversation's not been honest. And so that exchange is crucial, the quality of that exchange. Okay, system design. Stuart, anything further about that? We'll come back on it a bit with the contestability session later in the day. But okay, system design and stewardship. Look, what I find when we're dealing with this, we're sort of playing along two planes. One is an integration devolution continuum, and it's not either or. It's not we're going to integrate things or we're going to devolve everything. In a modern world, in order to devolve certain things, you will need to integrate others. So it's an unbundling and a rebundling. And then there's a sort of a choice monopoly continuum. How much choice and whose choice am I going to build into this, and how much is this going to be a monopoly? So this point I made earlier, that I think we're doing more. Some of the work that you're doing on engagement, and as I said, we'll have this session. It's next week. Yeah, Thursday of next week. Yep. It's really terrific work. I mean, it's just great work, and I'm looking forward to the case studies. I've read the material, and the material's wonderful. I'm looking forward to seeing the case study or the discussion. We are playing with sort of the bigger design questions and the stewardship questions, I think, more boldly. Not always wonderfully well. So let me just give you a couple of examples of how this looks different within Australia. So just to talk about the prisons example, that's just a schematic of a prison. So the New South Wales system is, 1,300 inmates in 34 prisons, another 19,000 offenders under community supervision through 60 officers, recurrent budget of 1.8 billion, 8,200 staff. So, you're dealing with a good, solid, meaty system, and it is a system. It's up until now been probably too much of a system or too much of a corporation, too much command and control, and so that's looking at how you move away from something you thought might just be about command and control, because in reality it never was, to something that is much more of a system with challenge and support dimensions to it is what we're dealing with. And so the New South Wales redesign that's going on has got various dimensions to it, in no particular order, a contract for a new PPP prison, the market test of an existing prison with an in-house bid, and the in-house team has won that bid, which is where the challenge of the union that I was referring to was going on. There's an update and a recompete to two existing prison contracts. Again, one of those was let 3 decades ago by a right of centre government, the other one was let a decade ago by a left of centre government. So you've got some bipartisanship here. Performance standards linked to desired outcomes for all public prisons, which we've not had. Cost benchmarks for all public prisons, which up until now we've not had. And a quasi-contractual arrangement with the frontline managers of the public system. So we're looking at there's a lot more to it than that. I've sort of given you just the bare bones. We're looking at something that is a system. There's been a couple of contract prisons sort of grafted on the side, not terribly sophisticated contracts. That's now, the whole thing is sort of being updated, refreshed, and lessons learned that will be rolled out across both the contract prisons and the public prisons. And the managers of public prisons will be given more of that authority to get on and do things within a realistic envelope. So it is quite an integrated system, as a prison system needs to be. You've got to move people around that system, and it's got to work as a whole. But there's a sort of an architecture being built within to that, which will permit it to work in quite different ways. Quite a thought, a sort of a fundamental rethink. Similar-ish things been done here, but there's been a lot of lurching as some of you perhaps would be aware, and not always with good results. So non-emergency patient transport, this is, I mentioned before, this is a clearinghouse. So again, because it is a statewide public hospital system, it is a system. There are local area health boards, but they are not NHS trusts. They do not have that level of independence. There's some work underway to give them more autonomy, but again, that's system-wide. I'll just focus on this particular one. It's where we did some of the early work on commissioning. And so there's sort of this unbundling process that I referred to. You've got this responsibility for system design and then for system operation, for the allocation of vehicles. This is essentially about algorithms. It's about computer. Now, the challenge here is that you've got a very large city and a very large metropolitan area. There's sort of conurbations on either side. And you want to try to optimise the allocation of vehicles across that system. So it's not just a bunch of, handing out a bunch of contracts or something to St John's Ambulance operate in Australia and operate in this space. It's not just about that. You're trying to make sure that you haven't got sort of dead legs as these vehicles move around the city. It's about optimising the resources that are used. The booking of vehicles, so this is sort of centralised. The booking of vehicles doesn't and shouldn't be being done centrally. It should be about it should be pushed down to hospital and probably to ward level. So it's about optimising, trying to clear beds and optimising the placement of people. And then the supply and operation of vehicles is a different question. And conceivably, you could have substantial involvement of non-government providers in that space. Now, what we had was sort of an ad hoc system on the supply side, with some of the local health districts setting up their own ambulance fleets and the ambulance red fleet. Again, we have one ambulance service for New South Wales, running red fleet vehicles, emergency vehicles, overstaffed, using them in downtime for green fleet purposes. So again, you can think about the redesign of a system as a whole, because you've got a much bigger geographic space. We're moving from a situation where it's been quite centralised and not necessarily terribly cleverly optimised into a space where we can begin to move the thing in different directions. Yes?
That previous model you had joined up commissioning to one side and said that wasn't a strong point of the model?
Sorry, the
joined up commissioning aspect.
Yeah, so we've not done as much of, we've not struggled with that question as much as you have.
This sort of model, where would you look? Because you look for something similar to this, but non-emergency vehicles and linking up with school transport and having a much bigger sort of collaborative exercise.
Look, it needs to be redone. I haven't been engaged with this space for quite some time. It does rely on, the previous government and previous minister had ordered a computer system, an allocation system, and so to some extent you had to go with that. Quite how it worked and how it was going to work was problematic. The government started to outsource in one place, and that was premature. So there was sort of, again, it hasn't been, as things rarely are in the real world, it hasn't been perfect and will probably need to be revisited. But yes, this is one of those places where, because there has been much more state provision, and it hasn't been devolved, you have the opportunity of optimising the sort of joined up commissioning dimensions of it and getting your sort of vertical separation and horizontal connectedness sorted a bit better. But we'd already begun to sort of spin off and wind up with the beginnings of a fragmented system. As I said, I haven't been involved in it for a couple of years, and it's sort of gone its own way. Voucher schemes, as I said earlier on, Australians actually do a lot of this. So our school education system in Australia is a voucher scheme, that you don't carry around a little card, you don't carry around a voucher, the money just follows the child. So they will just count how many children there are at a school, and money will be allocated based on that. I remember I was actually present at a speech that Milton Friedman gave many years ago, and someone said, do you think we should have education vouchers in Australia? And he looked confused and said, but you do. As I said, not optimally designed. Our healthcare system, in Australia, you have choice of GP. You don't have the lists that you've wound up with here in the UK. And I know that in theory, at least, that's gone away. In practice, at least when I left 5 years ago, it hadn't. What the Labor government did was it brought in a card which permitted you to go to any GP. And so if you need to pop out in the lunch hour to just go to a medical centre downtown to get a new prescription or to get something quickly checked, you can do that, and it's just billed back. And literally we carry a card like that, a Medicare card. So we have a physical voucher there. Low-income housing rental vouchers, that's not unusual. We've got that. It's part of the mix we use. Again, a Labor government in one of the states introduced a voucher for vocational education, copied in another